All right. Welcome, everybody, to this panel called Non-Proliferation and Strategic Deterrence, Assessing the Role of the TRIAD in U.S. National Defense. I'm Josh Rogin. I'm a columnist at the Washington Post. I am not a defense policy expert, but I play one on TV. I'm very, very honored to have what we can only be called an all-star panel. The way we're going to do this is I'm going to introduce our panel. I'm going to begin the discussion by throwing out some initial questions, and then we'll go to audience questions as soon as we can. First, on my immediate right, from the great state of Alaska, Senator Dan Sullivan. Previous to his legislative service, he served as a staffer on the National Economic Council, the National Security Council, Assistant Secretary of State for Economic and Business Affairs. So this is a message to all you staffers in the room who want to be a senator someday. It can happen. Hang in there. He's living proof of that. To his immediate right, Congressman Mike Rogers. Not that Congressman Mike Rogers. Not Admiral Mike Rogers. Congressman Mike Rogers from Alabama. Now that I think of it, probably the best suited to serve in the Trump administration of all the Mike Rogers.
That's right. Roll Tide.
In his 7th term as a congressman, chairman of the House Armed Services Committee Strategic Forces Subcommittee. Fun fact, at 28 years old, became the youngest person and first Republican to join the Calhoun County Commission. Thank you. Thank you for being with us. To his right, General David Goldfein, who is not only the 21st Chief of Staff of the Air Force, but I believe the first and only Chief of Staff of the Air Force to have served in the war in Serbia. And was shot down, but
thanks.
Was rescued.
Most pilots don't brag.
I'm getting to something. I read somewhere, and tell me if this is true, General, that you send your rescue team every year a bottle of single malt, good quality scotch. Is that right?
Macallan.
Oh, very nice. 12 year?
12.
Excellent, excellent, excellent. The General has an undergraduate degree in philosophy and is often described as exuding a quote-unquote quiet confidence. So not exactly the same temperament as our president-elect, so that should be an interesting dynamic going forward. To his right, former Senator Jon Kyl of the great state of Arizona, who in his final term of the Senate was Senate Majority Whip. Very famously led the fight on one side related to this issue against the New START Treaty. Despite coming out on the losing side of that battle, was named one of Time's 100 most influential people of 2010. And to his right, Honorable Congresswoman and former Undersecretary of State for Arms Control, Ellen Tauscher from California, who was actually the chairwoman of the Strategic Forces. Oh, sorry about that. The Strategic Forces Subcommittee years ago. And although she did win the fight over New START, was not named one of Time's most 100 influential people of 2010.
Thank God.
Yes. So what we're going to do here is we're going to go through some of the issues that were discussed related to nuclear deterrence during the campaign. And luckily, our president-elect actually said a lot about these issues. So what I'd like to do first is start with North Korea. And I'm going to be coming to you, General. And let me read you what our president-elect said about the U.S. commitment to deterrence in Northeast Asia. Let me just get it right here. All right, here it is. Okay. This is Donald Trump during the campaign. I'm prepared to, quote, if they're not going to take care of us properly, we cannot afford to be the military and police for the world. We are right now the police for the entire world. And you know what? I'm prepared to walk. And if they have to defend themselves against North Korea, where you have a maniac over there, if they don't take care of us properly, it's very simple. They're going to have to defend themselves. General, you just returned from a trip to Northeast Asia where you met with our Japanese and South Korean allies. Could you share with us some of your takeaways from that trip? What are our allies saying? What are their concerns? And what was your message to them?
Thanks, Josh. So I spent 2 weeks, actually, about a week in South Korea and then a week in Japan. And here were the big observations I found. First of all, the concern over the threat is real, and I would say real and growing. The power of having forward-based forces and forces that are in the region every day should never be underestimated. And part of that is the daily interaction that goes on when we, at least in the air component, and this is also the same for the naval component, the land component, when our forces are interacting every day, working through the daily challenges of interoperability and working. There's a strength that comes from that, and there's assurance that comes from that. The second observation that I got, and I heard this loud and clear from leaders both in Korea and in Japan, was that reliance and that the need for extended deterrence and the partnership that we have with them and their reliance on the deterrence that we provide. And again, from an air component perspective, one of the things that we do is we keep a continual bomber presence on Guam that we have used recently when North Korea has had some provocative actions. We've had that force, and we've reinforced our allies and our partners there, that we are in the region, we're there, we're deployed, we're with them every day, we're interoperable with them. And so that was a clear message that I was able to deliver, and it was absolutely on their minds.
Great, and let me stay with you for one more quick question. Another thing our President-elect said during the campaign about predictability, right? It relates to what you just said. He said, you want to be unpredictable. And this is the Donald Trump, I made a great business deal, and the person on the other side was interviewed by a newspaper. How did Trump do this? And they said, he's so unpredictable. And I didn't know if he meant it positive or negative, and it turns out he meant it positive. General, is unpredictability the new sort of policy for our nuclear deterrence in the region? Do you think that's really what the new administration is going to implement?
Yeah, I can't speak to the policy and how that would play in. What I can do is tell you that as a service chief and as a member of the Joint Chiefs, the lens I look through every day is options. What options can I make sure that I have available to the President so that the President can act in a way that he sees fit based on the situation at hand? And what I always want to be able to provide for him is the largest menu of options across the spectrum of conventional and unconventional, nuclear, conventional. My job is to present as many options as I can so that he has, and if there's an unpredictability in that because the President has more options, I've done my job.
Excellent, very interesting. Senator Sullivan, let me come to you. We talk a lot about the nuclear triad. One of the things that's actually not part of the nuclear triad but relates to deterrence very much is missile defense.
Yeah.
There have been some very recent actions in the defense bill regarding missile defense. Can you briefly explain to us what you've done, why you did it, and what impact you think it'll have?
Well, look, I think that this panel is about deterrence, and of course we're going to focus on the triad, which is very important. By the way, when we focus on the triad, we talk about missiles and bombers and submarines. I think it's always important to keep in mind who's behind those missiles and bombers and submarines. Our young men and women in uniform, literally 24/7 on all those missions. You talk about missile defense, Josh. My state, Alaska, we proudly really represent the cornerstone of the entire country's missile defense. And the 49th Missile Defense Battalion, that's what runs Fort Greely up in Alaska. That's where if there's a rogue missile from North Korea being launched someday at our country, that's where it's going to be shot down from. That's an Alaska National Guard unit defending the entire nation. So we're very proud of that. But it's also really important to recognize what's behind all the equipment. But when you talk about the equipment, my view on missile defense is that we have a important responsibility as policymakers to really start to focus on this issue. At the breakfast this morning, nobody says it better or more with more wit than my good friend Senator Lindsey Graham on a whole host of topics. You saw that this morning. But when he talked about North Korea and what President-elect Trump is going to face with regard to North Korea, it is a mess. And I think it's our responsibility to prepare, General Goldfein talks about options, to give the incoming administration options and time. Because here's the scenario I worry about. Right now, most Americans believe that the North Korean nuclear issue is a regional issue. Japan, Korea, China, and at some point, and I asked in his confirmation hearing, General Hyten, the Stratcom commander, when and if this is going to happen. But at some point, we're going to wake up, and our public is going to wake up to the fact that the head of North Korea, who's not very stable, not very predictable, is probably going to have the capability to hit our country with an intercontinental ballistic missile, with a nuclear warhead on top of it. Is that going to happen in 2 years or 3 years or 10 years? We don't really know, but it is going to happen at some point. And from my perspective, what we need to be doing now is preparing, particularly in terms of that threat, unpredictable, rogue nation, maybe 1 or 2 missiles possibly, to have a much more robust missile defense, a much more robust missile defense. So I think so in the NDAA this year, I had a provision in there that's required the Missile Defense Agency to do testing every year. That's something that has not always been the case for them. We're going to be looking at a long-range discrimination radar that's now being built in Alaska to significantly upgrade what we have at Fort Greely. We're going to have 40 ground-based missile interceptors by the end of the next year and a half. But my view is we need more. And I think that's going to be an important debate, whether those are based in Alaska, whether those are based on the East Coast. If we know that that threat is going to happen, if 3 to 4 to 5 years, Chicago or LA can be ranged, we need to do something about it now. And that would give whoever the president is in the White House an option that we can say, from a deterrence perspective, if you're a rogue nation and you're trying to launch 1 or 2 missiles at us, whether it's North Korea or Iran, we'll be able to shoot those down and then retaliate massively. And that's the kind of threat, realistic threat, that those leaders, who I don't think are very predictable, need to hear from the United States. And it's an area, by the way, where there's a lot of bipartisan support, I think, on missile defense. And it is an area where the president-elect has talked a lot about the need to ramp that up. So I think you're going to see a lot of focus on missile defense, and I think it's important given the threats that are developing for our nation.
Great, and I want to ask Chairman Rogers about that too. Before I do, Senator Sullivan, very quickly, we got a lot of reporters in the room. Help us make some news. What is your reaction to the Chinese outrage at President-elect Donald Trump's call with the president of Taiwan?
Well, Josh, you know I never like to make news. So you heard the defense minister from Singapore at breakfast, and what happened after the call, from my understanding, is that there was a focus with regard to the Trump incoming administration on focus on the one China policy. And you also might know that although there has been a long-standing practice where the president-elect has not talked to the leader of Taiwan, there's strong support in the Congress. And we were all at the Shangri-La Dialogue recently, and you might remember that after that conference in Singapore, a number of U.S. senators, led by Senator McCain, I was on the delegation, we went to Taiwan to congratulate the new president, to show support for the new president. So I think that having senior leaders show support for Taiwan, but still focusing on the One China policy, still focusing, by the way, on the Taiwan's Relations Act, which is something that was, as you know, devised actually in the Congress, not the executive branch, is an important part of our policy. And if you saw the Chinese reaction, it seemed rather muted. So
So if the Trump administration wants to increase U.S. support for Taiwan, you believe the U.S. Congress would support him in that?
I think that there's already a strongly established bipartisan policy in the Taiwan Relations Act and the One China policy, and there's a number of ways that you can show that support. As I mentioned, we had, I think that was the largest delegation of U.S. senators ever to go to Taiwan. That was just a few months ago, and I think that kind of support is appropriate.
Thank you. I think that's news. Chairman Rogers, I want to ask you to weigh in on the missile defense question, what's going on in Congress. And also I want to ask you to sort of share with this group a little bit of what we were talking about earlier is another aspect of deterrence, and that's space. And if you're willing to, can you share with us what are you thinking about what Congress may do in terms of extending U.S. defense, offense, deterrence into space?
Well, the issue of space has become dominant in our committee. Since the first Gulf War, we have become incredibly reliant, as society has, on space. In our domestic lives, we see. But the same is true in our military. You cannot fight and win a war now without space, and it's just a fact. The problem is nobody really owns space. It's kind of the redheaded stepchild of each of the services, but it's an important stepchild. And what we have got to recognize is that our adversaries know we can't fight and win a war without using space. And they have developed offensive capabilities that we have not done a good enough job of being prepared to respond to. And we're going to have to do that. This issue has become very prominent in the last few months. General Hyten has spoken about it very candidly, as has Admiral Haney. So you're going to see us putting a lot more attention on trying to develop defensive capability to make sure that our adversaries know that if they do go after our space-based defense assets, they will never take them all out, and that there will be severe response to that action. But that's going to take a dedicated effort by us. One of the things my committee is going to be focused on as we go into this next Congress is trying to look at the organization of space to try to make it more efficient and effective, because right now it is very cumbersome and lethargic, and that's just an unacceptable state.
Excellent, excellent. Now I would like to go to Congresswoman Undersecretary Tauscher. As our token Democrat on the panel, could I ask you to...
I just want to thank my friend John Kyle for letting me sit on his far right.
There you go, very nice. Well done, well done. First time for everything, first time for everything. So,
Great expectations here.
That's right.
so I want to give you the opportunity to respond to anything that you've heard so far, especially with regard to missile defense, something that you've obviously spent many years working on.
And a lot of money on. First of all, I couldn't agree more with both Senator Sullivan and my good friend and successor, Congressman Rogers. You know, I think that everything is always about balance. But I think what we have to know is that we have a missile defense system that is both a deterrence, but is a credible deterrence. And I think that for way too long in successive administrations, we were a little bit more Hollywood set-like than we were actually a system that our adversaries could actually believe was going to do its job. And I would be, if I was still in the Congress, which I'm not, I would be spending money right alongside with you, voting with you, to make sure that we had a robust, deliverable deterrent, one that was absolutely credible, and one that served as the kind of suitable deterrent that we believe our adversaries would have to see. And that also would transfer to our allies, to whom we've extended an umbrella, both in Europe and obviously in Asia.
Excellent. Senator Kyle, when you were negotiating and dealing with and leading the opposition to the New START Treaty, one of the things that you were able to achieve was an agreement from the Obama administration to greatly expand the modernization of our nuclear arsenal. That program, depending on which estimate you look at, $350 billion to even $1 trillion over the next 10 years. Now, we know that even 3 years in, there have been funding shortfalls, and there are even Republicans on Capitol Hill who have said, at least before the election, that this budget would have to be renegotiated based on fiscal restraints that face our nation. Now that may have all changed, okay? Now we're looking at a different fiscal picture, a different administration than we expected. What do you think we can expect for the future of this massive program that many in this room would agree that we need, but all would agree is, places strains on other parts of the budget?
Well, first of all, it's massive primarily because we've allowed it to atrophy, and we've allowed a lot of obligations to pile up that should have been taken care of from time to time. Let me correct something, not for the purpose of correcting you, but I think it'll provide some insight.
Please.
I did not lead the opposition to the New START treaty.
Oh.
I voted against it, but I didn't oppose it. Had I strongly led the opposition and opposed it, it may have ended up with the same fate as the 1999 Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which was defeated by the U.S. Senate. But I didn't lead the fight against it because I was successful in negotiating with the administration a change in the trajectory of the program, as well as some elements of the modernization of our forces. And because of that negotiation, I agreed not to try to defeat the treaty. And you're right, it did result in a substantial increase in the commitment. I regret that in the first 3 years, we're already $2 billion behind in the $85 billion committed just for the first few years. But that's as much the Congress's fault as it is the administration's fault. And there have been some slippages in some of the construction projects involved. If I could just make a point to remind everybody what's involved here. Our nuclear deterrent is really a composition of several things. The delivery systems are the TRIAD, and all three legs of the TRIAD have basically run out of their life and need to be replaced, all at the same time. We should never have allowed that to happen. But that's one reason for the incredible expense here, both the replacement missiles, the new bomber, which has at least been approved on paper, and the replacement for the Ohio-class submarines. Obviously, what they're delivering are the nuclear warheads and bombs. And again, we have postponed extending the life of those weapons, none of which had a real life of more than maybe 20 years, and these are weapons that were designed back in the 60s and 70s and built in the 70s and 80s, and they were never meant to continue in life for that long. So their life has to be extended. Every one of the life extension programs for each of the 5 major weapons that are currently engaged in that are behind anywhere from 1 year to more than 5 years. And there is no more time flexibility. As one of the lab directors said, we've run out of workarounds. So you've got the TRIAD that needs to be replaced, all of the weapons whose life needs to be extended, and then you have the facilities themselves, many of which were World War II or immediate post-World War II facilities with roofs caving in, unsafe conditions, and everyone agrees they need to be replaced. Well, one has been delayed, the replacement, by over 5 years, and it's substantially compressed in what it can do, and the other has been terminated. These have to be rebuilt as well. Those are 3 major expenses. And then you have perhaps the most important component of all, and that's the people. It's not just the people who run the systems. In Alaska, for example, the Guard unit that Senator Sullivan talked about. But it's our labs, our national laboratories, and the people who work in those labs. And as the General will tell you, any system that's not exercised you cannot have that great a confidence in it. Our lab systems, our system of people who research and develop, design and build, and then hopefully test these weapons, that hasn't been exercised. They're not designing new weapons. They're not building new weapons. They're not testing new weapons. And the skills that this requires have atrophied. All the while, the Chinese and the Russians and the North Koreans and the Iranians are moving forward very rapidly, each in their own way. And therefore, we don't have a breakout capability, we don't have a production capability, we don't have a capability of our people to quickly get back in the game and do what would need to be done, and we have an enormous expense that's built up. The good news is, and I'll conclude with this, that with all of this said, it is still a very small part of the overall defense budget. I think it would be between 3 and 6% or thereabouts, and over 30 years it's about 1/20th. So even though one could argue that it should be the #1 priority because the strategic deterrent is what prevents the one existential threat to the country from ever occurring, It is a relatively small part of the defense budget, and you're not going to save a lot of money by trying to cut this particular segment of the budget.
Thank you. I'm going to come to Senator Sullivan, but first I saw Undersecretary Tauscher shaking her head. So can we settle this about the 2010 New START debate? Was there something you wanted to add?
Well, let me just, I'm reminding myself that John's a friend of mine, and I want to remind him of that too. But you know, I couldn't be more strongly opposed to some of the things that he said. First of all, I represented for 7 terms in the Congress the only congressional district with 2 national weapons labs in it. Livermore, California, where we have Lawrence Livermore Lab, and Sandia, California. I sat on the subcommittee for all that time, then I became Undersecretary of State. We have the finest nuclear weapons program in the world. It is the safest and the most reliable. It provides the best deterrence, so good that many of our allies not only want it, but have insisted that we maintain it. The challenges that John's talking about, I can agree with. The first and foremost thing we must have as a free country and as the primary democracy and an excellent country is that we have to have the right people. And in a world now where my district is only 35 miles from Silicon Valley, it's very difficult to compete on a government salary for people that have the finest minds, that are going to actually think of the thing that is going to be out there over the horizon that none of us know about, that is going to be the threat for us in the future. Every president, especially this great president, Ronald Reagan, but every president from Eisenhower has committed to and worked to not develop new nuclear weapons, not fiddle with the design of the nuclear weapons, not change the platforms of the nuclear weapons, because our deterrence is not only important in its reliability, but in its predictability. And that is for both allies. And so when John says we haven't been exercising and we haven't been building new weapons, we're not allowed to. We have the finest arsenal in the world. We have too many of them. We have way too many of them. It would be like if I said I had to get to work tomorrow and I have a car in front of my house, but I also have bought 2 garages down the road, and I've got 2 cars sitting there on blocks because I've got to have a car to go to work tomorrow. Well, if I spent more money on maintaining the car in front of me, and I got to myself to a place where I believed that it was a reliable car, then I probably could be fiscally responsible enough to get rid of those cars sitting on blocks in the garage and keep that money and do something else with it, like maybe put my kid in school. That's the environment we have now. We've got a hedge weapon system that is 2x the weapons that we have in the strategic deployed arsenal. That is pretty damn expensive. Every year, the 3 lab directors get together and they certify to the president that the weapons system is safe, reliable, and effective. They have not had a problem doing that, even after 1993 when we decided we weren't going to do nuclear testing. So what we have to do in a bipartisan way, with all due respect, is come up with a way to have the right number of weapons that is fiscally responsible for this country, that extends our deterrence, that gives both our allies and adversaries the real, credible understanding that it not only works, but we're going to use it, but not so much that we can't be spending the money on the troops and their families and cyber and the next threat that's out there. And words do matter. We are not modernizing the stockpile. We're maintaining the stockpile. We need to modernize the facilities so that we can recruit the finest minds in the United States to come work at those labs so that we can protect ourselves in the future.
Okay, give me 30 seconds.
Sure, 30-second response.
I presume that the level that President Obama sought, the 1550, is agreed to by Representative Tauscher. I would argue that it's probably not enough, but in any event, that's what was agreed to, and we brought our numbers down to that. But in a way, it is a little bit like having that car sitting out there on the blocks, and because we haven't tested since 1992, we don't know when we turn the ignition switch on whether or not that battery is going to crank the old car up or not. When it was designed, it's a Ferrari. Our system is a Ferrari system, but that's part of the problem. The idea was that it would be continually reworked and maintained, and we haven't been able to do that. Other countries have built more robust systems that are less sophisticated, but they know that they work. And that's part of what we need to get back to with our system.
I'll give
let me
it
just make the point.
30 seconds.
The 1550 are in the ready arsenal of the deployed strategic stockpile. They're ready to go. It only takes one, by the way. So the 1550, there are thousands of others that are in my analogy of being in these garages down the street on blocks. They're damn expensive. Now, do we think that we need 1550 when it only takes one? Or do we need thousands more that we're spending a lot of money on? That hedge weapon stockpile is what we should actually take down.
Here's
Okay.
something we can agree on.
Yeah.
I agree that unlike Russia and China, which have production lines to produce new weapons, it would make more sense for us to create that rather than to rely upon the old warheads that are sitting on the shelf.
Okay, I'm not sure that's the point of agreement, but let me go to the. But I like the way you tried. It was a nice try. General, settle this for us. In your professional, nonpartisan, objective, expert military opinion, who's right?
I've already been shot down once. I'll go for a second one here. Actually, if I could, though, let me comment to a few of the conversation.
Sure.
First of all, Senator, thank you for talking about this as an enterprise, because it absolutely is an enterprise. And what we didn't talk about is what ties it all together, and that's nuclear command and control. Mm-hmm. And that's what keeps the president connected to all of the legs of the triad, and it's reliant heavily on space, to your point, in terms of not only how do we sense the globe for indications and warnings and present that to the leadership, but also how we keep the president connected in a way that he is always connected to his force. And so that has to be on the table when we talk about the actual enterprise, the nuclear enterprise. And then, ma'am, to your point, it's probably helpful to go back and ask ourselves, why did we build a triad? Why 3 legs? And the reality is each of the legs presented a particular attribute that we were looking for. The missile fields and the ICBMs gave us responsiveness. It was what the president had at his fingertips to be able to provide a responsive capability as a deterrent. The air leg, the bomber leg, was there for flexibility. Mm-hmm. It's the one part that you can not only semi-control yields, but you can also call it back. So it was the most flexible, deployable part of the triad. And the third was the most survivable, which is if in fact there was, God forbid, a first strike, we would still have a survivable leg. And then when you add all 3 of those together, what you then have is a nuclear deterrent. And so if we're going to be talking about the deterrent, we got to talk about the enterprise, and we got to make sure that if we're going to walk away from that, we're walking away from a key attribute that was pretty well thought out in the 1960s, and I would argue still applicable today.
Yeah, but let me press you briefly, and I do want to get our sitting lawmakers in on this discussion. The modernization program, as it's planned, as it's conceived, the one that we're debating right now, can that be pared down while maintaining that deterrent as far as you're concerned?
Well, first of all, remember we built this, we just already talked about, designed in the 60s, built in the 70s, right? It was upgraded to a certain extent during the Reagan era, and it hasn't really been touched since. And that's really what's placed us where we are today. So as we do cost estimates for programs that we really haven't looked at in terms of procurement and advanced technology across all of the 3 legs, it ought not be a surprise that we have a bit of a wide margin between various cost estimates, because depending on which assumptions you're looking at and which systems you're looking at, your costs are going to be different. So you threw out $1 trillion, $350 million, all the different. The fact is that as we go down this path, we're going to refine these costs over time. And as we refine our costs, it's going to give us the opportunity to look at efficiencies. But in the beginning, what we really need to do is have a discussion. What is the role of nuclear deterrence in the 21st century? What is the role of conventional deterrence in the 21st century? And how do some of our new capabilities in cyber and space all contribute to deterrence? And then how does this go forward? And how does the triad play?
So strategy first and then budgeting. Interesting.
Yes.
Interesting. Who would have thought? Who would have thought? All right. I know Senator Sullivan wants to.
Well, Josh, I think there's actually, there's a good discussion and debate here, but I want to echo what Senator Kyle mentioned and General Goldfein just mentioned about there's been a lack of focus on modernization, but I think that's changing. So if you look at, we're going to vote on the NDAA conference report this coming week in the Senate. That has strong bipartisan support. In that, there's $17 billion, which is what the administration requested to operate, maintain, and modernize the enterprise. An additional $9 billion for extensions of the life spans of our weapon systems, again in the TRIAD. That's $26 billion that's being authorized. That's strong bipartisan support. That is serious dollars, but again, as Senator Kyle mentioned, that constitutes about 4% of the DoD budget. And even if you look out for the plans over the next 10 years, which is, the plan right now is to focus for a total of about $234 billion over 10 years for modernization. That's still in the range, longer term of 5, at its peak, even 6% of the whole DoD budget. So that's a lot of money, but I think it's important enough and it can be done. The one issue that I think is going to be the critical issue that I know it's not part of the discussion here, it's a discussion for a whole nother panel, is making sure our acquisition process works. And we've had some hearings recently on the Armed Services Committee on programs where it hasn't worked, and some of those are very well known. And what we've been trying to do in the committee, and we got in last year's NDAA, is have reforms, for example, giving the service chiefs much more responsibility over weapons programs, to make sure that if we're spending that money, we're not wasting it with enormous cost overruns and weapon systems that aren't delivered on time and are delivered way over budget.
Thank you. Chairman Rogers.
Yeah, I just want to revisit this issue of commitment to modernization. We have to remember the world is watching. Ellen is right. We have the best arsenal in the world. It is a credible deterrent. But it is not going to last forever without us putting serious commitment behind it. And when our allies and our adversaries see us flying 52-year-old B-52 bombers with openly acknowledging we intend to fly them till they're 80 years old. We have Minuteman III missiles that were built and put in service with a 10-year lifespan in 1970, and we're still using them. When we have B-2s that are 30 years old and we intend to use them for another 15, when we have $3.7 billion in deferred maintenance in our national labs that you heard both Senator Kyle and Ellen talk about, that is not showing a commitment to nuclear deterrent and the TRIAD that I think our allies and our adversaries need to see. The fact is, while it's large numbers in dollars, it is not a big percentage of our defense spending. We are right now spending 4% of our defense budget on this effort. At the height of the proposed modernization plan by the Obama administration in 2020, it's only going to be 7%. So we've got to send clear signals that we are committed to this deterrent and that we are going to fund it adequately. And I would point to the changing environment in the world as the reason why. This administration came in the office 8 years ago with very ambitious goals toward disarmament, as were evidenced by the New START treaty reductions and other things. They've come full circle around. This administration has put in place a very aggressive and real modernization plan that I hope the Trump administration will get behind and follow through on.
Excellent, excellent. I want to change the subject a little bit and do one more round of questions before we go to the audience. The Obama administration, according to a report in the Washington Post about 2 months ago, was considering a range of new nuclear deterrence policies to unveil before they left office. And the reporting of them engendered some pushback and some reactions, not just in Washington, but around the world. Chief among them was this idea that we should declare unilaterally a no first use policy for nuclear weapons. Now, they didn't ultimately do it. I guess they still have a couple of months. It doesn't seem like they're going to do it. But I wanted to ask, first, starting this time with our Democrat representative, Undersecretary Mrs. Tauscher, what's the argument for declaring no first use, if that's what you believe? And then maybe we can hear the argument against, if anyone else on the panel might believe in that.
Well, the administration's position, I think many people understand. I think that, presidents going back to President Eisenhower, including President Reagan, believed that nuclear weapons were inherently dangerous in and of themselves, and that it was important to make sure that we have policies that make sure that the weapons are understood by both allies and adversaries, and that we have policies that actually engender for people for whom we are not going to use the weapons, people that are in compliance with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, people that don't have weapons themselves, that there's a whole class of people, frankly, 140 countries, where we would actually not use nuclear weapons on them, and to make it clear to them that they're not part of the opportunity for us to use them. And that was done in the 2008, 2009 Nuclear Posture Review. I think that there are a lot of people in the world that are looking for reassurance. Part of the things that this administration could have done but didn't was make a case for why the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty should be ratified. There are 8 countries that need to ratify it for it to go into force. If my bet that the North Koreans have a 5th nuclear test sometime around the inauguration actually comes to fact, we're going to be looking around and figuring out why we can't do something to really hammer them. Well, we can't because we don't have a comprehensive test ban treaty. And we're one of the reasons we don't. We have a policy not to test. We can prove that we don't need to test to have a stable, safe, and reliable stockpile, but we have not ratified the treaty. And the reasons we didn't back in 99 when John opposed it were fairly good reasons, but now in 2016, 17, 18, there are reasons why we could. And it would actually create for us a much better world environment where people believe that we were going to keep our non-proliferation treaty obligations but still have a safe arsenal without testing. So I think that I think that the administration ran out of gas on a number of different things. And, on this issue of whether the president was going to take minor reductions like Ronald Reagan did on the way out the door, or whether he was going to sharpen the rhetoric about first use or the trigger status. I think that they have, after floating some ideas, they've decided they don't have the political consensus to do it, and they've passed.
Oh, thank you. Very interesting. Senator Kyle, no first use, CTBT?
Well, first of all, North Korea is not doing what it's doing because we haven't ratified the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty. I think we could all stipulate to that. And those things which they are bound by, including a series of UN resolutions they have refused to comply with, and the UN doesn't, although there's just now a brand new set of sanctions, hasn't been able to stop their program. Those aren't the ways that you stop a rogue program like North Koreans. Ever since Eisenhower, every president, Republican and Democrat, has adhered to essentially the same very predictable and public policy with respect to what our use of nuclear weapons, what the conditions for that would be. I think it is wise for President Obama not to have changed that so far, and I hope and don't think that he will change it, so that the string of presidents, both Democrat and Republican, ever since Eisenhower, who recognize that we need to have both predictability and just a little bit of unpredictability with respect to the no first use aspect of it, is a good policy. That's worked, it's stood the test of time. And the final point is, there are some who conflate deterrence, strategic nuclear deterrence, with non-proliferation. And let's understand, it's the other way around. The fact that we have had a very strong deterrent policy protecting at least 30 other countries has enabled those countries to rely on us and not have to build their own weapons. And so deterrence actually advances the cause of non-proliferation.
Excellent. General, that, but also, if you can share with us, what's the latest? Is Congresswoman Tauscher right? The North Koreans are preparing a new nuclear test? We won't tell anybody.
Yeah, that's right. And I would say, though, you really got to go back to the fundamental elements of what constitutes effective deterrence. And I believe it's a combination of capability and will. And if you get the capability piece right, and you have the will piece right in terms of what those around the world that may choose to take us on think that we may or may not do, then what you have is effective deterrence. And so I think you got to look at the discussion of no first use through that lens. Does a no use first policy actually add to deterrence when it comes to capability and will, or detract? And as long as we're clear-eyed about what we're talking about going forward, I think we can have a reasonable debate.
I'm inferring that you think it detracts.
My personal opinion is it detracts.
Interesting, thank you. And let me just give the chairman and the senator a chance to close on these or any other issues before we go to questions. Chairman Rogers? You can pass.
Well, yeah, I think that a degree of unpredictability is healthy. Going back to an earlier question you had, and I think it applies here. I think our adversaries need to be afraid of us, and that no first use policy does not engender that feeling.
Fair enough. Senator?
Well, I just want to add to what General Goldfein said. It's deterrence is capability, will, and credibility, which is a little bit different than will. You need all three. And, you know, on the issue of the no first use or ambiguity on first use, I think it's important to remember that that's always been talked about in U.S. policy, again, as Senator Kyle mentioned, across administrations, Democrat and Republican, to respond to a massive conventional attack. So it's always been kind of a defensive idea, which is different from a first strike idea, which nobody ever here talks about.
It's a good point, or a chemical or biological attack, or
Right.
something short of a nuclear attack. That would be good. That's a very good point. Before we're going to go to questions, I promise. But Senator Kyle, I heard that you were in discussions with the Trump transition team to be Secretary of Defense. Is that true?
No. It's not. I let it be known back in August that while I was very happy to talk to some of the folks who had reached out to me, not to offer me any position, but just for some counsel, that my government service was done. I left the best job one could ever have as a U.S. Senator, and I'm not going to go back into government service, though I enjoyed it very much.
Excellent. That's another piece of news. Somebody tweet that. Okay, so we're going to go to the audience. Please ask to step up to the mic if you'd like to ask a question. Please tell us your name, your affiliation, and please put your comments in the form of a question. Who would like to be first? Don't everybody jump up at once. Yes, sir.
My name's Rob Seuss. I'm with Applied Research Associates. We're a mid-tier defense contractor. I'm particularly interested in hearing from the panel. We talked about the big stuff, the strategic deterrence. We hear a lot from the Russians on the new doctrines of escalate to de-escalate. And I'd just be interested in some comments on how we deter that particular threat, or what we should be doing to deter that threat.
Who wants to start? That's a good question. Senator Kyle, is that your?
No, I'm pointing to the
Oh,
general.
we're looking at the general. Okay.
This is the general's bailiwick.
Yeah, go ahead, sir.
I'm not sure that the deterrence, though, that we're thinking about and actually talking about here is that much different. Because what you're really trying to do is to cause a potential adversary or competitor to question, what are going to be the costs associated with this action? And what you need is, and to point of, we talked about unpredictability, what you want is enough of a pause or a question to say, is this going to cause a reaction that's going to impose costs on me beyond the value of what I'm contemplating? And so the same deterrent value, and deterrence, by the way, is a combination of everything we've been talking about here in the nuclear arm, but it's just as much the conventional arm and everything that we do there. And so I'm not actually sure, the way you pose the question, that what we've been talking about is that much different, because we're trying to create the exact same effect in the mind of the Russian leader. What are the costs associated with this action, and are those costs going to outweigh any potential value? And what we want is options on the table that keeps him from moving forward.
Let me quickly follow up. How do we deter the Russians in cyber?
Well, first of all, we already are very active in the cyber domain.
They don't seem to be very deterred.
Well, here's what I can say. In terms of the way we are organized right now to defend the nation, which you've always got to look at activities that we're doing in any domain as a subset of how we do joint operations, and the military element of that is actually a relatively small subset to what the president has to think about when he thinks national security. When I think national security, I'm thinking about how I defend the nation, and how I've got aircraft that are on alert, how I've got folks right now that are watching and active in the cyber domain, how we've got folks that are active in the space domain. I've got the Commandant of the Coast Guard here who's looking at, who's responsible for the coastal waters right in Homeland Defense. And so we're looking at this part of the national security spectrum. I've got to understand, as I give best military advice, that the president is looking at this level of the national security spectrum, because I don't come to work every morning thinking about Wall Street. I don't come to work every morning thinking about federal aviation and our international and the airspace. I don't come to work thinking about Amtrak as a member of the Joint Chiefs. So when I offer best military advice in terms of how we defend the homeland from a joint perspective, I've got to understand that he's thinking about this with a much broader spectrum.
I think that's very fair, actually. So I'm wondering if, because as we talk about deterrence, it's hard not to acknowledge that our idea of deterrence must change as the threat changes. I'm wondering if any of the lawmakers, former lawmakers, would care to comment on how do we deter from these types of low-intensity warfare, hybrid warfare, low-intensity provocations?
Well, I think it's a great question, and I think it's something
Thank
that
you.
we have been, yeah, great question, Josh. We've certainly been focused on the Armed Services Committee, but I don't think there's been a clear answer yet. And from my perspective, it relates to what you're talking about, which is that there seems to be very limited costs right now to actions in the cyber domain in terms of aggressive actions. And I think we need to look at a whole kind of broader range of raising those costs in terms of retaliatory actions. And it might not need to be cyber versus cyber tit for tat. We might, I think, have to start looking at more asymmetrical types of responses and better signaling, meaning clearly indicating to other countries, perhaps not publicly, but through different channels, if you undertake this action, be prepared to some kind of retaliatory action in a place and timing of our choosing that might not be in the cyber domain. But right now it's a very, very difficult and challenging area of strategy that's very fluid, and I don't think there's a full answer right now.
Excellent. Senator Kyle?
Yeah, just back from cyber to the strategic nuclear deterrent, the Defense Minister of Norway this morning helped to answer the question with respect to different kinds of threats, as you said, evolving threats. They feel much more threatened now because Russian military leaders have said that Norway is now part of their strategic target because they've been cooperating with us. And her answer was, I think, the correct one. We've got to show a lot more commitment to the Article 5 NATO defense commitments and continue to convey that in ways that are credible and that the Russian military leaders understand it in the same sense that the general pointed out.
Excellent, excellent. Sidney?
Hi, Sidney Friedberg from Breaking Defense. The president-elect has made it something of a point of pride that he is not, in every respect, entirely aligned with the foreign policy, national security establishment. And I'm curious, and we have the stories that maybe he said, why can't we use nuclear weapons? That may or may never have happened. He's made some comments on first use that people have tried to interpret. From what the panelists have seen, what about what Trump has said in this subject of deterrence is reassuring, what is troubling, and what, if you were able to sort of convey to him one key message to take into the Oval Office, what is the thing that you would want him to absolutely keep in mind about the nuclear arsenal?
I see Congresswoman Tauscher is signaling that she'd like to weigh in on this. Go ahead.
Well, I think, Sidney, I think it's quite fair to say that these days, apparently, what you say in the campaign, it's a lot like Las Vegas. The campaign is Las Vegas, and when you become the person in office, you can reset. I'm willing to take that as an opportunity for President-elect Trump. The one thing, if I could advise President-elect Trump, is that the Secretary of Energy pick is enormously important. 60% of that portfolio is the nuclear weapons complex. And so picking somebody from the oil patch is not a good idea. I sat on the Mies-Augustine panel that looked at the NNSA. I'm often accused of being the mother of the NNSA. The problem isn't the mom, it's the fact that it had two fathers, Mac Thornberry and Pete Domenici. And so, exactly.
Yeah. Finally, a headline.
Exactly. So I would say to President-elect Trump, I strongly encourage you to read the Mies-Augustine report, and I strongly encourage you to pick, like has been done twice before with Jim Schlesinger and now with Ernie Moniz, someone with real nuclear weapons experience to be Secretary of Energy, since it's 60% of the portfolio. And then he would have an advisor that actually could really provide him with what he needs to know.
Are you throwing your hat in?
Absolutely not. I don't wear hats.
Senator Sullivan?
Well, I would say on the encouraging side, and I talked about it at the outset of my remarks, is President-elect Trump's focus on the importance of missile defense and building that up more. And again, I think that there's a growing bipartisan support for that. You're seeing it on this panel. In terms of additional areas of advice, I think whether you're talking the nuclear enterprise or conventional forces, is just the importance of our allies and our system of allies and the comparative advantage we have as the United States, where we're very much an ally-rich nation. Our adversaries or potential adversaries, whether it's Russia or China or North Korea or Iran, are ally-poor, and that's incredibly, incredibly important. And I think if you look at some of the remarks and testimony over the last several years from General Mattis, he's somebody who is very much focused on that strategic advantage of strong allies, and I think that's important.
Think Mattis will get a quick confirmation?
I'm certainly going to be working for that.
Okay, that's maybe. Barbara, thank you.
Barbara Starr from CNN. General Goldfein, for you in particular, sir, two questions, North Korea and Iran. On North Korea, is it your analysis and feeling that they, in fact, are, I think this came up a minute ago, getting ready for another underground test? There are publicly published satellite photos indicating they're working at that site. What concerns do you have about another nuclear test by them, especially at a time of transition in the U.S. government? And on Iran, what is your assessment and the Joint Chiefs assessment if the Trump administration were, in fact, to walk away from the Iran deal, what Iran's response would be with its own nuclear program and the concerns you have about national security and security in the Middle East?
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. So I should say thanks.
Thanks a lot.
Yeah, thanks.
Always a pleasure.
Thanks a lot.
So first, North Korea. What we've seen is a continual dialogue from the leader in North Korea that continues to make statements relative to progress towards nuclear testing, what have you. We have seen through intelligence analysis a bit of a say-do gap at times between what he says is going to happen and what actually happens. And so, as you might imagine, we're watching that very closely, and the entire intelligence community continues to watch that and provide analysis to the leadership as we go forward. And it is troubling to see the continuation of movement towards, trying to gain access to a nuclear weapon. And so I would just describe that as a member of the Joint Chiefs as clearly troubling. And under the leadership of General Dunford, all the chiefs and the combatant commanders have come together over the period of the last several months and have produced a classified national military strategy. That national military strategy that will be presented to the President and the new team is one of the first times we've actually done a classified military strategy with an annex that we have focused on the 5 global challenges: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, violent extremism. And that has been a very iterative process led by the Joint Staff under the leadership of the chairman, with both the Joint Chiefs and the combatant commanders all contributing. And that work is now approaching completion, and so there's a North Korean annex that's a part of that strategy that we're putting forward that the President-elect will have a chance to look at. Now, when it comes to Iran, there's also an Iran annex in that because it's one of the 5 global challenges: Iran, China, Russia, North Korea, violent extremism. While we don't know whether we have that framework exactly right, because history could suggest that perhaps we aren't the best at predicting the next war, what we found as Joint Chiefs is that if we're ready for these, then we're likely ready as a pacing option to ensure that this military is ready to be able to support the President with whatever decisions that he chooses to make. Now, with respect to Iran specifically, we are quite concerned with the continued malign activity that Iran is actively engaged in across the region, and the instability that's inserted across the region, primarily in the Middle East, but we're also seeing Iranian activity beyond that. So we looked at it over the course of this past year. We laid this into an Iranian annex as part of the national military strategy, and we're prepared to lay this all out for the President-elect.
General, if I could just press you, Barbara, correct me if I'm wrong. I think her question was, if the nuclear deal goes away or changes in some way, what's the effect of that on our deterrence posture vis-a-vis Iran? Is that right, Barbara? Come up to the mic. Yeah.
If the new administration lives up to its campaign promise and walks away from the deal, do you then, the Joint Chiefs, the Defense Department, do you then have to assume that Iran will in fact restart its program, go back to trying to achieve a nuclear weapon, and the implications for the Middle East? And
Got it.
Also, do you actually think that North Korea is preparing for an underground test?
Okay, I think he declined to answer the North Korea question already, but let's take one more run at that Iran question because I think it's a good one.
They might, but the question really, though, is what are all the elements of power that go into a campaign plan that would keep them from going forward? Very often, I think we tend to look through the military lens first, and we ask the question through what the military can do. But having spent a year with the State Department, as part of my upbringing and getting a sense of what it is our foreign service does for us every day, I'm here to tell you that as a member of the Joint Chiefs and a service chief, I'm here to advocate on behalf of our foreign service as well in terms of what they do, bringing economic challenges to Iran and doing all those other things that we do that would keep them from restarting a nuclear program. So it would have to be a whole-of-government approach that would have to come in if, in fact, the deal was to be reversed in any way.
Okay, thank you. Next question.
I'm Marshall Rowe, and I served aboard USS Decatur DG-73 as a ballistic missile defense technician in Aegis. And I was wondering what's going to be the future of sea-based ballistic missile defense going down the line.
Good question.
Anybody from the sea-based?
Sea-based. Chairman Rogers, I'm looking in your direction.
I do think Alabama's going to win the SEC championship the next day. And then in January, the national championship.
I can actually jump on that. So part of when I was deployed forward as the air component commander for then General Mattis as the CENTCOM commander, one of my roles was the area air defense commander. And so when Aegis cruisers, when Patriots, when THAAD, when other forces deployed into theater, my job was to pull them all together and through command and control be able to do defense of the Arabian Gulf. And so I will tell you that having spent a lot of time on the cruisers and seeing exactly what ballistic missile defense capability we bring through the Navy, I see it as an absolutely essential part of our force, an essential part of how we do ballistic missile defense. And I'd be one, as a member of the Joint Chiefs, to absolutely advocate for that continued capability.
Excellent.
Yeah, and I do, in seriousness, want to emphasize, I think that the Aegis system is going to be a critical component, not just the shipbound capability, but the Aegis ashores. It's my hope, going back to the Asian Pacific and the threats that we've got there, that we can get a more Aegis capability in the Japan area, which will unleash some of those ships in that region to cover a broader scope of responsibility, but they're critical.
Excellent. That is going to have to be the last question. I would like to close by just saying that it's clear from what we've seen here today that the new administration will have a range of very sophisticated, very high-quality advice from military, legislative, and expert contributors who have shown us today that you can disagree without being disagreeable, and I think we can all agree that they deserve our gratitude for their years of service to our country. Let's give them a round of applause, and thank you very much for participating.